I've been about a bit. I'm the only man in the history of mankind that has swum across the Straits of Johor. I had to avoid a police launch. It was either that or Changi. They've got me passport in Singapore. Yeah, I swam it. Yeah, nobody's ever done it before. Not because of the currents or anything like that. Nothing like that. It's sharks. It's not shark infested, but none of the locals go paddling. Yeah, I swum it. I know about sharks, yeah. I'm 6'3" and 16 stone, 200 weight, yeah, I'm swimming. These pumps were hanging around my neck when I done it, yeah. I thought, well, jaws are the conditioner, I know how to condition people, yeah, jaws, boom, 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 yeah. They're just flying about, you've got an art job works, yeah. Sharks, they'll have a look at me and think, yeah, I know how to do it, you punch them right in the fucking ear hole and they swim off.
He's intelligent, but he can be very short-tempered. And he has a reputation, and has on a number of occasions assaulted staff. He's certainly a reputation for being quite violent.
And Paul Sykes came up from the side and hit him with a dumbbell under his cheek, where he has actually still got the scars up till today.
We could have gone right to the top quite easily. In fact, I think it was about 1,000 photographs on the pole. Saying as a future
All the guards intimidated by him because he was known to just knock people out, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, knock him out, yeah.
Especially the likes of fucking Sykes, you're big and rough and tough and nasty, and then we can make people just crumble to whatever they want. And that's one of the sort of people he was having sex with when he was putting a fucking page 3 fucking girl on her back.
So you said he was a perpetrator of these assaults, Sykesy.
He was notorious for this. He had younger inmates. You know, he didn't like them. He couldn't get at them 18, 19, but he'd get them at 21, 22, and he used to take his pick of this. And he was notorious for actually physically bullying and attempted to bully staff.
He was enticing it in with bits of food all the time, and that when he got it in, he broke the cat's neck, because when they looked at the cat and it was taken off him, the cat, its neck was broken. So how evil is that to do that to a little cat?
He thinks he's somebody and he's not. He's just somebody that's been in prison all his life. And there's nothing clever about that.
I was never a bad man, just did bad things. Paul Sykes was a man who lived 2 lives. One as a talented boxer with the world at his feet, and the other as one of Britain's most notorious criminals. His story is as complex as it is compelling, marked by moments of triumph in the ring and dark spirals of violence and depravity outside of it. In this video, we'll take a closer look at his dark yet tragic life, exploring the highs and lows that defined him, from his early success as a heavyweight boxer to his eventual downfall, driven by criminal activity and a life of self-destruction. This is the story of the wild man of Wakefield, Paul Sykes, a man whose own mother once said she'd have let him hang if she were the judge at one of his criminal trials. Paul Sykes was born on May 23, 1946, at Manygates Hospital, after his mother, Betty Sykes, endured a grueling 5-day labor. The birth was so intense that Betty, under ether, couldn't hold Paul for 2 days, a detail she later wondered might have shaped the troubled man he became. Throughout his turbulent life, she often wondered why her son became such a monster, attributing it mainly to her violent husband, Paul's father, Walter Sykes. Walter, a strict disciplinarian shaped by 10 years in the army, and later as a prison officer at HMP Wandsworth, carried his authoritarian nature into his family life. When Walter and Betty brought their newborn son, Paul, home to 36 Dacre Avenue on the Lupset estate, it wasn't long before Paul, too, became a victim of his father's explosive temper. A former army boxer, Walter treated Paul like a human punching bag, subjecting him to brutal beatings. One of his preferred punishments was whipping his naked body with a belt buckle while he cowered helplessly in the bath. These violent experiences left deep scars on Paul, scars that he carried into adulthood. He could never forgive his father, and the rage born from those beatings shaped him into a man who would go on to inflict pain on others. An avid boxing fan, Walter bought Paul his first pair of gloves at age 4 and began molding him into a fighter. He would train Paul at home by making him do push-ups and sit-ups, and by having him punch a pillow strapped to his torso. By age 7, Paul trained at a boxing club most days after school, but it felt more like punishment. He became a punching bag for older boys, fueling a lifelong resentment. As an adult, he often questioned how his father could claim to love him while allowing such beatings during his childhood. He took to boxing like a duck to water, though, and as a junior fighter, Paul was a force to be reckoned with. At just 11, he began competing, but between 15 and 17, he truly excelled, representing Yorkshire and England at the junior level and winning numerous trophies. At 16, he won the NABC title, which earned him a trip to Germany for an amateur European bout. Despite getting blind drunk the night before, he still managed to hold his own against a full-grown adult, though he ultimately lost to the German boxer. As a teenager, Paul began to spiral out of control. He started stealing cars for joyrides around Wakefield, drinking cheap alcohol, and smoking cigarettes in Thorns Park, much like many underage drinkers still do today. But Paul's behavior quickly escalated beyond typical teenage rebellion. He bought a pellet gun, initially using it to shoot at stray pigeons, but soon turned it into a tool for crime. He would rob garages, pretending the gun was real. But scaring the cashiers wasn't enough. He'd beat them senseless just for kicks. At school, his grades plummeted, and his attendance became sporadic. Snapethorpe School, which had little trouble with him before, now saw a student who assaulted teachers and stopped caring about anything but his impulses. The boxing skills he had learned in the gym became his weapon of choice. He'd intentionally provoke others, wearing silly hats to invite sly remarks, then brutally attack anyone who dared to mock him. Paul found he enjoyed hurting people, relishing the role of abuser after years of being abused. By the time he graduated high school in 1962, his crimes caught up with him. In 1963, he was convicted of 22 offenses from the past 2 years, earning a 7-year prison sentence and his first headline in the local paper. But the prison system wasn't ready for the animal they were about to cage. At just 17, he was sent straight to an adult prison, an unusual move, as these institutions were typically reserved for those over 21. And this wasn't just any prison. He was sent to HMP Wakefield, infamously known as the Monster Mansion. Wakefield, a Category A maximum security prison, is home to some of the most dangerous and vile criminals in Britain: sex offenders, child murderers, and serial killers. This was Paul's first experience of incarceration, surrounded by monsters. He adapted to prison life much like a caged apex predator, calm as long as he was fed and left alone, but still dangerous if provoked. With endless time on his hands, Paul focused on fitness, transforming his already giant frame into a well-oiled machine, even on a diet of porridge and water. In a brutal environment where only the strong survived, he quickly established a fearsome reputation. His boxing skills made him a force to be reckoned with, and he wasn't shy about using them. He fought the toughest inmates and prison screws alike, proving he was someone not to be messed with. After breaking a few jaws, he became feared. To keep him in check, prison guards would let him bend the rules, such as getting extra food or being allowed to smoke weed in his cell. Their fear was justified. Paul was capable of serious violence. During one escape attempt, he hit a guard so hard the man was left in a vegetative state. Yet Paul wasn't just brawn. Despite flunking school, he had a natural intellect that, like his body, thrived with the right training. In his cell, he found solace in books, devouring 4 a week. Literature became his escape, and he grew knowledgeable on various subjects, even completing complex crosswords from The Guardian in under 20 minutes. He made the most of his time, earning 22 O-levels, 8 A-levels, a BA in physical science, and certifications in bricklaying, swimming, and football refereeing. He mastered British law, often representing himself in court and occasionally winning. Over his life, he spent time in at least 12 different prisons, including Armley, Strangeways, Hull, Liverpool, and Durham, among others. By 1990, Paul had been transferred 25 times, often landing on special wings reserved for the most dangerous offenders. He served time alongside infamous criminals like the Cray twins, the Richardsons, and Charles Bronson. Yet even among these hardened cons, Sykes stood out. In the 1970s and 80s, the Home Office ranked him as one of the top 5 most dangerous prisoners in the country. Between 1962 and 1985, Paul accumulated multiple convictions: 2 for wounding with intent, 2 for violent robberies, 5 for actual bodily harm, 1 for grievous bodily harm, and several for assaulting police officers and guards. In the 13 years after his first imprisonment, Paul Sykes was free for only 9 months. The people of Wakefield lived in fear whenever Paul was free. His demonic reputation spread citywide, making Paul Sykes a well-known name long before social media. Known as the Wakefield villain, Paul was instantly recognizable in the 1970s and 80s by his mustache, stylish dress, imposing figure, and booming voice. Though never a successful criminal, he earned a notorious reputation as a vicious thug. His alcoholism only made things worse. Bouncers and bartenders were on edge whenever word spread that Sykes was drinking nearby. Pubs and clubs would empty out as soon as he walked in. He was bad for business, but no one dared tell him to leave. Despite his violent nature, Paul Sykes had an entourage, young lads who worshipped him, women drawn to his bad boy reputation, and fellow criminals who respected him. In his prime, he had a following eager to be in his presence. He was often found in local pubs and clubs like Heppy's Nightclub, Rooftop Gardens, The Malt Shovel, and Lupset WMC, surrounded by admirers as he regaled them with stories of his life. Charismatic when he wanted to be, he commanded attention, especially from women. Despite the obvious red flags in his behavior, he committed crimes across the UK, including robbing bookies, burgling homes, selling drugs, stealing cars, running protection scams, and breaking legs for £200. Many jobs came from underworld connections made in prison, and he even sold stolen goods through his mother's market stall. One of the more lucrative schemes involved fake auctions, where he used his talent for lying and manipulation. He'd auction desirable items, but buyers received something entirely different. This scheme led him to meet his first wife, Pauline, the love of his life. In 1973, Pauline met Paul Sykes at one of his auctions, where she bid on an expensive camera but received a cheaper model. Unlike others, Pauline wasn't intimidated and confronted Paul directly, showing more courage than most men dared. They moved to Blackpool, where Paul became a lifeguard and earned a Silver Cross for saving a life. Within 2 months, they married, and Pauline became pregnant with their first son, Paul Jr. It seemed like a stable marriage was within reach. But with Paul Sykes, stability never lasted long. He soon reverted to crime, including a shocking claim of strangling a cat belonging to their landlords. Pauline refused to tolerate his behavior, and when Paul was sent back to prison a week after their wedding, she ended the marriage, leaving him to face the consequences alone in his cell. There was a sinister side to Paul Sykes that many people don't know about, one that's rarely discussed. Beyond his violent reputation, Paul had a disturbing tendency to torture and kill cats. In Charles Bronson's book, Legends, he recounts a chilling incident where Sykes killed and skinned a cat that had wandered into their prison cell. He then paraded around the wing wearing the cat's fur on his head like a Davy Crockett hat, a macabre display of his darker impulses. But Sykes had an even darker side, one that extended beyond violence and cruelty to animals. Disturbing rumors swirled through the prison, rumors that added a sinister edge to his already fearsome image. While some inmates admired his fighting skills, others feared him for a much more chilling reason: whispers that he was sexually assaulting young offenders. Sykes was openly bisexual, a self-confessed switch hitter who liked what he called girly geezers. He admitted to sodomizing men in prison with a page 3 model's photograph stuck to their backs. In Paul's own words, he never forced anyone. He claimed that all his encounters were consensual. But do these rumors of assault hold any truth? I'll share the evidence and leave it up to you to decide. Homosexual activity was common in prisons at the time, and former Strangeways officer John G. Sutton discussed it on his YouTube channel. He specifically mentioned that Paul Sykes, part of a group of alpha males, groomed younger, vulnerable prisoners, offering protection in exchange for sexual favors. Was this consensual or a form of sexual abuse? It's likely that these young men felt they had little choice but to comply. Many ended up on the medical wing with severe injuries, but they rarely admitted the true cause. Tragically, some were so traumatized by the experience that they attempted, and sometimes succeeded, in taking their own lives. Unconfirmed rumors claimed Paul Sykes would drag inmates into his cell, knock them out, and take what he wanted. Another rumor suggested he targeted and assaulted young inmates while working as a cleaner on a young offenders wing, with no interference from guards. One of the more outlandish claims involved a baccy game, where Sykes offered tobacco to young prisoners who could squeeze through a chair gap. When they got stuck, he would assault them. It's plausible that Paul Sykes groomed young men with offers of protection, then coerced them into sexual acts, exploiting their vulnerability. a clear violation of their liberty, and a sexual crime. Many victims may still be haunted by these memories. However, the notion that he could repeatedly assault inmates without consequences is hard to imagine. Yet, if there's any truth to these rumors, it's disturbing that he was never held accountable by the law. Paul Sykes dreamed of going pro in boxing and reached the 1973 ABA semifinals, catching the attention of promoters. However, his criminal record prevented him from getting a license, despite a chance to reapply later. This rejection led him back to crime, resulting in a 5-year sentence. In prison, Paul connected with manager Tommy Miller, who promised to help him reapply and manage him professionally. After his release in 1977, Tommy advised Paul to stay clean for 6 months, a challenge for someone with Paul's background. At 30, though considered too old for a serious career, Paul's size still gave him an edge. Despite his commitment, Paul couldn't stay out of trouble. He began auctioning counterfeit jewelry and was frequently arrested, though he often escaped serious consequences by pleading his case in court. His drinking remained an issue, and one night, in a drunken altercation, he bit a chunk out of a friend's ear, leading to an arrest for GBH and time on remand, nearly derailing his boxing career before it began. His manager was furious, fearing this incident would ruin Paul's chances of getting a boxing license. But Paul, confident in beating the system, assured Tommy that his friend wouldn't press charges, and he was right. The friend declined, and Paul was released weeks later. Despite the police's determination to pursue the case, his manager used his connections after the 6-month wait to secure Paul's license, marking a pivotal moment and setting the stage for the most lucrative period of his life. He began his professional boxing career in 1977, quickly making a name for himself with a series of wins. Despite a setback in his second fight against Neil Malpass, where he was disqualified for headbutting, Sykes bounced back with notable victories, including a dominant win against Dave Wilson. However, his career faced challenges as he struggled with alcohol and inconsistent training. But his career took a dramatic turn when he was unexpectedly chosen to fight for the British and Commonwealth heavyweight title in 1979. Originally scheduled to face John L. Gardner, Neil Malpass's car accident opened the opportunity for Paul. With only 8 fights, and at 33, Paul earned the title shot, setting a record for the fewest fights before a title opportunity. He trained for the fight in America, sparring with Leon Spinks, who had just famously defeated Muhammad Ali. However, the training didn't go as planned, and Paul's preparation was marred by heavy drinking and poor discipline. On fight night, June 26, 1979, he faced Gardner, a skilled defensive fighter. Gardner withstood Paul's initial onslaught, and, by the 6th round, Paul, exhausted and frustrated, turned his back, a cowardly move in the eyes of boxing fans that effectively ended his career. Gardner retained his titles, and Paul's boxing aspirations were over. Upon his return to England, Paul was sentenced to 30 months for burglary and assault. When he later hospitalized 2 prison physical education teachers, an additional 3.5 years were added to his sentence. His unruly behavior led to him being placed on a newly formed special unit at HMP Hull, alongside 7 other inmates deemed the most serious offenders. This special unit at HMP Hull was a highly controversial experiment aimed at reforming volatile inmates through a softer, non-confrontational approach. Instead of being reprimanded for verbal abuse or disruption, prisoners were spoken to calmly in an effort to avoid escalation and break the cycle of their offending. The experiment garnered so much attention that the BBC was granted special permission to film and observe the unit's unique approach. The documentary, Danger Men, aired in 1989, featuring a brief segment on Paul Sykes. In the film, Paul is shown returning to the special unit after spending time in segregation for assaulting a guard. After the documentary aired, producer Roger Greenwood, impressed by Paul's presence on screen, decided to make a film centered on the enigmatic ex-boxer, just as Paul was due to be released from HMP Hull. The documentary, Paul Sykes at Large, released on Yorkshire TV in 1990, remains a widely watched and discussed piece of television. It introduced Paul Sykes to audiences around the world and captured the complexities of his character in just 50 minutes. The film is a mix of humor, entertainment, shock, and sadness, making it a golden piece of television that could never be recreated. One of the most iconic scenes shows Paul in his cell, wearing only shorts as he combs his trademark mustache and begins his narration. "I've had 10.5 years for whacking screws, and 10.5 years for whacking coppers. I've never taken a liberty in my life. I've belted a few people. On every occasion, I was in the right. As he walks down the wing, he confesses, "I'm an expert at violence. I've been at it all my life." The documentary also highlighted his novel, Sweet Agony, which he was working on while in HMP Hull. The book, considered his magnum opus, won the Arthur Koestler Literary Award in 1988 and was published in 1990. It chronicles his life between 1977 and 1979, detailing his struggles to adjust after prison. Despite his hopes, the book's success was limited, though Sykes compared it to major autobiographical works and sold it around Wakefield himself. However, his mother, Betty, offered a sobering perspective. He thinks he's somebody, but he's not. He's just somebody who's been in prison all his life, and there's nothing clever about that. His brief moment in the spotlight in 1990 quickly faded. Like many artists, his work gained the most recognition only after his death. As his fame dwindled, so did his prospects. Now in his 40s, with his book a commercial failure and no steady income, Paul's life spiraled out of control. He began drinking heavily, eventually becoming drunk daily. His reign of terror and notoriety as a hard man was coming to an end. Alcohol became his only solace, transforming him into a different kind of nuisance than Wakefield had previously known. Holding on to the last remnants of his hard man status, he started a debt collection business called Last Resort Debt Collections, charging clients £200 to collect their money. A notable client of Paul's debt collection service was the prolific pedophile Jimmy Savile. Some claim they were close friends, but whether their relationship was strictly business or something more remains unclear. Given what we now know about Savile, this connection casts an even darker shadow on Paul's already tarnished reputation. With no meaningful pursuits left, he sank deeper into alcoholism, drinking to the point of oblivion. His debt collection deteriorated into violence, even against friends, and he resorted to bare-knuckle boxing for cash. He was even set to fight the governor, Lenny McLean, for a big payout, but got too drunk the night before, ended up brawling with some bouncers, and was too injured to take part. His fighting skills declined, leading to defeats against weaker opponents. An incident with local tough guy Colin Beaumont highlighted his downfall when Beaumont smashed a stool over Paul's head, splitting his scalp open so deep that you could see his skull. Despite nearly dying, he discharged himself from the hospital to drink again. His behavior became increasingly erratic as he terrorized the patrons of Wakefield's drinking establishments. No longer just intimidating people into buying him pints, he would brazenly walk into pubs and restaurants, sit down with customers, even families, and consume their food and drinks. He took pleasure in humiliating his victims, forcing them to recite nursery rhymes, bark like dogs, or commit other demeaning acts. His harsh discipline damaged his children. His first son, Paul Jr., became a heroin addict and petty criminal, while another son, Adam, followed a similar path. Despite promising to be different from his father, Paul caused the same harm. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Paul Sykes' life sharply deteriorated. In 1998, he became homeless and lost his parents, Walter and Betty Sykes, within 12 weeks of each other. Walter advised his daughter Kay to avoid Paul, while Betty urged her to care for him. At their funerals, he was expected to be disruptive but stayed away, possibly too drunk to attend. He later visited their graves, often falling asleep there drunk. Despite his circumstances, Paul yearned for pub company but was barred from all Wakefield pubs. Too weakened by alcohol to fight back, he was regularly thrown out whenever he tried to enter. Once a feared figure, he became a destitute, labeled by locals as a dirty tramp. With a bushy beard and tattered clothes, he roamed Wakefield's streets, often seen with a can of special brew, rummaging through bins and picking up cigarette butts. His hands, crippled by arthritis, made tasks difficult, leading him to ask passers-by for help with his beer. By the early 2000s, he had lost all dignity. He became unapproachable, often talking to himself or pigeons, and engaging in disturbing behaviors like urinating in shops. His incontinence and verbal abuse led to frequent police interventions. Despite his downfall, the victims of his past never forgot his misery. As news of his decline spread, they emerged, seeking retribution. Once a feared villain, Paul became an outcast in Wakefield, subject to ridicule and revenge from those he had once terrorized. In 2004, His son, Paul Sykes Jr., was sentenced to life in prison for a heinous murder, stabbing a fellow drug addict to death over 50 pence. Before his arrest, Paul Jr. and his father had been squatting together, consumed by drugs and alcohol. Paul, horrified by his son's crime and now vulnerable, faced a brutal reckoning. Having made many enemies over the years, he was targeted by gangs of teenagers seeking revenge for their fathers and grandfathers. They pelted him with eggs, urinated on him, beat him, and even set him on fire. These attacks frequently left Paul hospitalized with fresh cuts and bruises. Despite the relentless abuse, he never informed on his attackers, adhering to a code of silence. While the violence he faced was cruel, it starkly contrasted with his former terror, and these boys would never have dared confront him a decade earlier. In his final year, Paul Sykes sought redemption, attending Wakefield's Baptist Church and studying the Bible as he faced his mortality. Stricken by delirium tremens and severe liver damage from cirrhosis, his health deteriorated rapidly. He was given a flat where 2 sisters cared for him as he succumbed to Parkinson's or dementia. Once a formidable figure, Paul had become a frail shadow of his former self. His battle with alcohol had left him debilitated, and eventually, he was found unresponsive in a bus shelter. Rushed to the hospital, he lapsed into a coma. When he awoke, his sister was by his side, offering forgiveness. Desperate for a drink of water, Paul could only ask for it, but it was too late. He was ordered nil by mouth. In his final hours, all he wanted was one last sip. Paul Sykes passed away on March 7, 2007, at age 60. By then, he was a shadow of his former self, skeletal and unrecognizable except for his large hands. His funeral, held a week later at Wakefield's Baptist Church, was packed with those whose lives he had touched positively. Despite his many flaws, Paul had moments of impact, and his funeral reflected this. He was dressed in a suit, his bushy beard shaved, but with his trademark mustache intact. Attendees chose to remember the vibrant, larger-than-life figure he once was, the boxer, author, and world traveler. As his coffin was carried in, "Always look on the bright side of life" played, honoring the motto he lived by until the end. Paul Sykes will continue to live on in prison and Yorkshire folklore. He once told a friend, "I always want to be remembered. As a hero or a local bum, either will do." And when people taunted him, calling him a has-been, Paul would reply, "I'd rather be a has-been than a never-was-been." He certainly lived up to both of those statements. He was a villain, a thug, and a thief. A nuclear bomb who self-destructed, with aftershocks that spread for miles. The damage he caused is still felt today. He hurt many, brought joy to few, but no one can deny that he was unique and tough as nails in his day. There will never be another like him. Paul Sykes was truly one of a kind, and it's unlikely Wakefield will ever see someone like him again. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the tumultuous life of Paul Sykes. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Dark Sleuth Secrets for more compelling stories of history's most fascinating characters. What are your thoughts about his story? Do you have any stories of your own to share about Paul Sykes? Drop them in the comments if yes. We'd love to hear them. Take care of yourselves, and until next time, stay curious and keep sleuthing.